What is an Islamist? A potentially dangerous extremist or simply an activist whose Muslim faith is central to their political vision? My guest today is in the thick of that controversial debate. Maajid Nawaz is a British-born Muslim who became a radical Islamist. He was arrested and imprisoned in Hosni Mubarak's Egypt. And when he emerged from prison, he renounced his former views and launched a campaign to counter Islamist ideology. To some, he's a truth teller. To others, a traitor. How does Maajid Nawaz explain his extraordinary transformation? Maajid Nawaz, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you.
I just alluded to an extraordinary life story which has taken you from rebellious street kid in a typical English town to a die-hard radical Islamist and now to somebody absolutely committed to the political fight against Islamism. Are you convinced that you've actually found yourself now?
Well, anyone who's read my autobiography, Radical, will actually probably end up with that conclusion that I have. And the reason I say that is because when you arrive at liberal political thinking that can basically accommodate all views as long as these views respectively tolerate each other, it's pretty easy to accept differences at that stage.
You remind me, if I may interrupt, you remind me of the famous historian Quilliam who declared the end of history. And of course, we've seen plenty of history. I mean, maybe you are wrong here. Maybe there are things that could happen in the world that might shake your current belief in Western liberalism.
I don't think liberalism is Western. I don't think we've reached the end of history. And allow me to explain why I don't think liberalism is Western. I think that human civilization is the culmination of us building upon what we learned as human beings from other civilizations. Even democracy that originated in Greece as a concept was preserved by the Arabs and then translated through Islamic Spain into Europe. I think the essential idea that Muslims are bound to tolerate differences of opinion is ingrained in the fact that Islam doesn't have a clergy. And therefore there isn't one official version of Islam. So I think there's nothing inherently un-Islamic or un-Eastern about tolerance of difference of opinion.
Right. We are going to talk a lot about Islam and politics, the relationship between the two. So let's just get a few things clear for our audience. You were raised in a Muslim family in the United Kingdom. Are you an observant Muslim today?
I would not hold myself out as a role model for anyone who's religious. I am a Muslim, I believe in Islam, but I don't put myself out as devout in any shape or form.
But the question was, are you observant?
Well, I don't think that term has really much meaning because everyone's a sinner. You know, for example, I will pray, I will fast, but I will not hold myself out as any role model for Muslims. I'm not speaking religion, in fact, at all. I'm speaking politics. I'm speaking of the dangers of when one's view of religion is enforced in the political sphere.
But it's difficult, isn't it? You say, I'm speaking politics. I'm not really speaking religion. But, you know, we're in an area where everything is complicated. And it seems to me that one of the complications is that personal relationships are tied up with identity and with religion and with politics. It's all mixed up together. For example, since you have made your transformation, which we're going to talk about so much, what have your personal relationships been like with family, for example? Have some of them seen you as a sellout, as a traitor?
Well, of course, I was... my entire social life, including my marriage, was with people that belonged to my former organization. So when somebody leaves a group like that and becomes heavily critical of that group, that does have an impact on those relationships. So I don't want to disrespect those ex-family members of mine or even current family members of mine that remain sympathetic to the Islamist ideology. What I will say is that, of course, by me criticizing those views in public, they no longer are sympathetic to me in me doing that work.
I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. Are you saying that as soon as you reached the decision you reached about renunciation of your previously held political views and ideology, you knew as soon as you did that that your relationship, for example, with your wife had to be over by definition?
I've written about that, so that's pretty much what I've said, that it's a decision that nobody can make lightly, which is why so many people who leave Islamist organizations, don't then go on to speak about it in public. And the reason is it has a social cost. It has an effect and an impact on the relationships that you've built up over 10 to 15 years of your life. And it's not easy to then make a conscious decision to say, I'm not only going to speak about something I believe in and challenge what I used to believe in, but I'm aware that it's going to have a cost on my friendships and my relationships. And I don't blame anyone for not taking that extra step, knowing that that's the consequence of making that decision.
Let's take this step by step. So let's start at the beginning of your journey in the small town of Southend on the east coast, southeast coast of England. What was it about your upbringing, do you think, that left you open to the radical message? Was it victimization? Was it racism that took you to that place?
There was a lot of serious and violent racism that I experienced as a teenager before the age of 16. I'm talking about attacks with hammers and screwdrivers and knives. There was also police discrimination, institutional police discrimination. But these grievances, and they were grievances, I maintain are insufficient as the only explanation for the process of somebody's journey towards extremism. Something else has to happen, because many people experience racism, but not everyone who experiences racism goes on to join an Islamist organization.
So what was it in your case?
Well, in addition to these grievances, I'm not excluding them, I'm saying in addition to these grievances, one has to adopt an ideological narrative. And that narrative is the catch-all explanation that tells people that, yes, these grievances, this racism, I'm being targeted simply because I'm a Muslim, and in that I find solidarity with Muslims across the world who are also being targeted simply because they're Muslims, whether in Bosnia, in Chechnya, or in Palestine. And then a narrative emerges that tells us that Muslims are being fought all over the world, and that the only way to defend Muslims is to fight back and establish a caliphate that will defend the rights of Muslims across the world.
Yeah, but there are Muslims who could identify with some of that and not all of it. There are Muslims who could feel a great deal of sympathy and indeed political support for fellow Muslims suffering in other parts of the world without going the step you just made to support of a caliphate as the response.
That's entirely true, and that's the difference between those who join Islamist organizations and those who don't, despite both having grievances. That's a false
to come
narrative.
back to my actual question, why did you make that step to believe that the only responsible answer for a Muslim must be active support, a political duty to try to achieve this notion of a caliphate?
There are, in general, there are a few factors that lead to somebody doing that, and these are the factors that also led to me adopting these views. One is the grievances that I've spoken about, the other is the narrative I've spoken about, a third is an acute sense of identity crisis, not knowing whether I was British, whether I was Pakistani, which is the country of my heritage, or whether I was indeed Muslim. These identities all came to a head, and then the fourth factor, I came across a charismatic recruiter who was able to join these dots for me in that way. And as an angry young 15-year-old, running from hammer attacks from skinheads and dodging police discrimination, in the days before the Stephen Lawrence case and the term institutional racism was coined by the McPherson report, it was a very tempting narrative to adopt, to be able to explain all the grief and the anguish that I saw around me, including in Bosnia. But I take full responsibility for that.
If I may point you to a particular story, because it just intrigues me on many levels. There's the story of you and your older brother when, after a series of skirmishes with a racist white group in your hometown of Southend, you were confronting them one more time. It looked as though you were in for a very physical fight. And your older brother took charge, and he managed to persuade these young white kids to walk away in a way that you clearly were very impressed by. I just wonder, in the retelling of that story now, if you can explain to me what it did to you and your mindset.
Well, we were surrounded and we were outnumbered and we were weaponized as well, if you like. And I pretty much thought we were about to get completely beaten to a pulp. My brother stepped forward and he called the leader of this group over to the other side of the road, and he was wearing a green rucksack at the time. And he said to the leader of that, and this was a Combat 18 supporting group, these were neo-Nazi paramilitaries, and he said to this man, you may outnumber us, you may certainly have more weapons than us right now, but in my bag here, I have a bomb. And if you do choose to attack us, I will take you out and us with me. We will all die, but ultimately, we don't fear death. My brother had adopted the Islamist narrative for a year prior to that incident, and had been attempting to recruit me to this narrative, and I'd been refusing because I didn't essentially want to change my lifestyle. When I saw this, I saw the immediate results that a narrative could achieve. Far more than weapons, far more than having backup and knives and friends, but essentially a propaganda that can strike fear into the hearts of your enemy way before even having met them. I realized that this was in a form of protection and a form of identity that could actually achieve results. And again, as an angry young 15, 16-year-old, it all started to make sense. In the early 90s and to mid-90s, Islamism was the revolutionary ideology of so many young British Muslims and Muslims across the world.
Why then, if we can fast forward, and we must because we've got a lot to get through, why then, when you were stuck in this Egyptian prison, as you'd become an activist for Hizb ut-Tahrir, very radical group, you'd gone around Europe and then Pakistan and then Egypt trying to recruit new activists to the organization. You were imprisoned by Mubarak's security apparatus. Why then, at that point when you were stuck in an Egyptian jail for years, did your commitment to this cause weaken?
Well, I co-founded the group in 4 countries by that time, and I was 24. I was still very young. When I entered prison, 2 things happened that pretty much began the 5-year process of me unraveling my political ideology. And they were, first, that Amnesty International adopted me as a prisoner of conscience and began campaigning for my release. This was the first time that I really truly appreciated what I had defined as the other, campaigning for my rights, even though I believed them to be my enemy and the enemy of my people, in quotation marks. And so that began a rehumanization process for me. It began me to allow to start empathizing with the other.
But why? I mean, I'm very well aware Mubarak's security organizations were arresting huge numbers of Islamists, Muslim Brotherhood supporters, people they feared could undermine their grip on power. You were one of them. That's why you were in prison.
Indeed.
But many of them reacted to, for example, being turned into prisoners of conscience by Amnesty International by hardening their commitment to a political struggle against the dictatorship that was backed by the West. But you didn't harden your commitment at all. In fact, you lost your commitment. I still don't understand why.
Well, that's not entirely true. I was actually involved quite heavily in the Egypt uprising via media from London. My commitment to overthrow Mubarak and all Arab dictators has remained. What changed was the ideology that I used as a vehicle to agitate for their overthrow. In fact, I've been attacked by Glenn Beck on Fox TV for my incitement against Mubarak over the media.
But forgive me, I mean, in recent weeks you've been writing about what's happening in Egypt, and you seem to suggest, and I read what you wrote quite clearly, you seem to suggest that it was no bad thing that the Egyptian courts had dissolved the parliament, which of course, as a result of a democratic election, is dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood. You seem to suggest that was quite a good thing.
No, that's not true. What I said was that we need the democratic trinity to be rooted in Egyptian society, and that is democratic culture, democratic institutions, and democratic processes. What I said was that if people are worried that the Brotherhood are dominating the Egyptian political scene, they shouldn't be, because they no longer control parliament. Even if I disagree with the Islamist ideology, I will not ever contradict the will of the Egyptian people to say that they don't have the right to elect who they want.
Sure. When you talk about these fears of an Islamist takeover in the post-Arab Spring Middle East, are you not raising the spectre of something which, frankly, is not really there? I mean, if we look at Tunisia, we look at Libya, we look at Egypt, in various different ways we've seen the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists playing a very important role in the post-revolutionary political process, and yet we see that democracy seems to be winning out, and that the Muslim Brotherhood forces are highly adaptable, highly flexible, and appear at the moment to be tolerant.
Especially in the Libyan context, where the people that actually, the majority that took the election results were non-Islamists. But even in Egypt and in Tunisia, in fact, if we take the Tunisian example of the Nahda party winning, who are the Islamists, they experienced their own clause 4 moment. They ditched the condition that Sharia must be a source of law. And the Brotherhood have, within their own organization, the ability to progress along those lines. I think the people that are ratcheting up this fear-mongering are actually those who still subscribe to the neoconservative model. What I've tried to do through my articles is calm those fears down. So I find it strange that you're saying I'm the one playing up those fears. I'm trying to calm those fears down. I don't know what you've been reading, but that's actually what
I've been reading an awful lot of things, both your recent statements about what's happening in Egypt, but also looking back at some of your Quilliam group statements from the last couple of years. For example, I'm sure you well remember when one of Britain's leading newspapers got hold of a document which was said to be from Quilliam, your organisation, sent to the Director General's Office for Security and Counter-Terrorism here in the UK. This is in 2010. And one of the quotes from this leaked document was, quote, "The ideology of non-violent Islamists is broadly the same as violent Islamists. They disagree only on tactics."
Indeed. So what
is
that means,
what you still believe?
Yes. What that means is when we talk about ideas, those who desire to impose an interpretation of Islam over society by law. That's the definition of Islamism that I used in that document and that I still believe is the definition of Islamism. I'm sure you and I would both agree that attempting to impose one version of religion over society by law, whether through violence or through legislation, has serious human rights consequences. That's the definition of Islamism. The difference is Al-Qaeda attempt to do that through terrorism, so they're banned. The Muslim Brotherhood attempt to do that through democracy. So that means we have those reservations about them, but we respect the will of the Egyptian people to elect them.
I'm very confused.
Allow me to...
Are you telling me, based on what you said 2 years ago, that you still see the people who are currently in power in Egypt, including President Morsi and the dominant forces in the Egyptian parliament, as broadly the same as the violent Islamists? They only differ in tactics.
See, broadly the same isn't what we're saying. What we're saying is the idea, the desire to impose.
But it is what you said then. I asked you if you retracted it. Yeah, no, it is, because the quote is quite plain.
The same.
It's quite plain.
Okay. Look, Stephen, you can have communists who are militant and you can have communists who are non-militant. They still believe in communism. The difference is that some believe in it through violence and some believe in it through agitation and others believe in it through elections. It's the same with Islamism. Now, for you to sit there and say that I am attempting to equate the Brotherhood with Al-Qaeda when I've clearly said that the military must refrain from interfering in Egyptian politics and that the Brotherhood's results in the presidential elections must be accepted, and that the solution to that instead is to further root the democratic culture, institutions and processes in Egyptian society, is rather odd. Because
with the greatest of respect, I'm not trying to plant any notion in your head or in the audience's head. I'm simply trying to make sense of whether you have changed. And it seems to me,
does that make sense, what I've just said? That you can be a communist and militant, and you can be a communist and not militant. Likewise with Islamism, but you still believe in the same ideology.
But what I'm trying to get to is when you look at the Arab Spring, and goodness knows I'm sure you regard it as just as an important phenomenon as everybody else does in the world today.
Well, more so actually, because I've suffered the consequences of Arab dictators personally.
That may be true.
Torture.
So when you look at it, and when you try to explain to me how you've developed your ideas from that particular quote I mentioned from 2010, are you telling me you regard people like Mohamed Morsi, President of Egypt, as a man you can trust or a man that you have to fundamentally distrust because in the end he is still part of an Islamist movement that you say, in ideological terms, is broadly similar to groups like Al-Qaeda?
I distrust every politician. What I'm saying is there are some politicians who adhere to liberal values that I distrust because they may be power hungry, and there are some politicians who adhere to Islamist values that I distrust because of their ideology, but they may not necessarily be corrupt. Every politician has their pros and cons. When it comes to the Islamist politicians, my concern with them isn't necessarily their corruption. My concern with them is the values and the ideas they believe in. Now, they may evolve. The Tunisian Islamists have evolved. So this also doesn't mean they can't evolve. What it means is we must constantly be vigilant and scrutinize the values and the conduct of every politician.
What about
That's not really that hard to understand.
Sure. What about the British Islamic institutions, which, again, your organisation, Quilliam, has spent so much time and energy criticising? For example, the same memo, going back a couple of years, listed the Muslim Council of Britain, the Muslim Safety Forum, and a group that was actually set up by Scotland Yard, the Muslim Contact Unit, as, quote, dominated by extremist ideology. Have you changed your mind on any of them?
You see, my critique of the Muslim Council of Britain isn't about whether they're Islamists or not. I don't believe in the communitarian and communalist approach to politics. I don't believe that Muslims are some form of fifth column as an external bloc in this society who we need to engage with by saying, bring me your leader, where is your chief?
But frankly, whether you agree with that approach or not is neither here nor there. The only issue...
Well, of course it is, because that's the criticism in that document.
Well, the only issue in this document is whether you are justified in calling them extremist and, by clear implication, saying that they are dangerous.
The Muslim Council of Britain, like the Muslim community in this country, are made up of many different views. So it would be incorrect for anybody to say, as a whole, the organisation is extremist. What I'm saying is, the critique that I have is that Muslims should be engaged with in this country through their representatives in Parliament, not through umbrella organisations that are set up to somehow treat them as a separate entity to the rest of society. That's unhealthy for Muslims themselves.
There's been a big debate in this country in recent months, maybe recent years, one could say, about the degree to which, to understand extreme ideology within Muslim communities, you have to understand the anger, the sort of nationalist feeling that has come with, for example, Western policy in Iraq. Do you believe that is an important factor?
Absolutely it is, yeah.
So, when you have suggested there is a pathway from Islamic identity politics, through to radicalization, through to extremism, through to violence, which doesn't pay account to this anger that comes from Western actions in countries like Iraq, it's misleading.
No, it does pay account to it. I don't understand how it doesn't. I've said that radicalization is caused by a combination of grievances, identity crises, charismatic recruiters, and ideological narratives. All four are factors we have to address through policy. Grievances can be real or perceived. If they're real, then policy needs to change. If they're perceived, then the messaging of that policy needs to change. Identity crises are real, and what it means to be British, for example, and the inclusiveness with which this country has started to, in recent years, embrace people of different skin colours is an important factor in that. When I was growing up, it wasn't so inclusive. Charismatic recruiters need to be challenged, and that's part of the work that we're doing. And ideological narratives need to be challenged. All four of these factors need to be addressed.
You talk about the work you're doing. It's been difficult for your Quilliam organisation recently because you've had government funding taken away. It seemed to expose the fact that your organisation was very heavily dependent on millions of pounds of government money.
Millions is an exaggeration. We were heavily dependent.
About 3 million over 3 years, wasn't it, up to 2010?
Yeah, when we founded Quilliam, we were around 80% funded by public grants, as were many, many other organisations, including those, by the way, that you just named, those who I was critical of because of the umbrella model that I spoke about. So we were heavily funded by public funds, but that was cut in December 2010, and the reason it was cut is because we disagreed at the time with the direction that the government was headed. Now that the strategy has changed and the policy of government has changed, what we haven't done is revitalize those funding relationships, but rather now we're 100% privately funded. And I'm happy with that because, of course, it allows me to be able to do the work without having to face the sort of questions about whether which government is funding you and whether you're pursuing a government.
So to be clear about it, when your opponents were saying that you were heavily influenced by government, not least because you were taking government money, that was true to a certain extent, because you're now saying, as we're freed from government money, we're much more free to say what we really believe.
What it means is that when we began realizing, when we began facing some of the challenges in the discussion, we didn't compromise. And I think that's to our credit, because we could have compromised and stuck with the funding, but we didn't. We basically went out on a limb to say we don't agree with this aspect of the policy, and as a result, the relationship ended.
Do you think, and we've talked a lot in this interview about the impact of the Arab Spring, do you think the Arab Spring has fundamentally changed mindsets, not just in the Arab world, but in the West too, and that some of the fear that there was when your Quilliam organisation was founded, fear of jihadi extremism coming from Muslim communities, that fear has dissipated because we have seen, as we've discussed in this interview, that Islamism in the Middle East has proven much more flexible, adaptable and tolerant than you might have expected?
Well, not that I might have expected. I mean, I knew the Nahda, for example, in Tunisia were always quite flexible and adaptable. But I think that the fear element that I've been trying to calm down with my articles, in fact, I've written not only in the Wall Street Journal, but in the Financial Times and in the Times here, trying to say to people that it's not as bad as you fear that it may be, because these organizations, first of all, they don't form the majority of those societies, and so they're naturally constrained by public opinion and other institutions and other political parties. But second of all, the political side of these Islamist groups, many of them have already shown an inclination to ditch their clause 4 moment, ditch the idea that Sharia needs to form a basis of law.
And the notion of conveyor belt extremism that you have peddled in the past may be outdated.
I think you're misinformed. I've never peddled the conveyor belt idea. What I've said is that non-violent extremism is a problem in and of itself, whether it leads to terrorism or not. It's like racism. If racism exists in society, whether it leads to violent racism or not, it's still a problem, even in its non-violent form. And so likewise with Islamism, if somebody believes in ideas such as whether they're anti-Semitic or homophobic or anti-woman or anti-minority within other Muslim groups, if somebody believes in some reprehensible ideas, whether that leads to terrorism or not, it's a problem for integration in society and needs to be addressed through civic action and policy, regardless of whether it leads to violence, regardless of this so-called conveyor belt theory, because actually there's no evidence either way for the conveyor belt. There's no evidence it moves either way.
All right, we have to end there, we're out of time, but Maajid Nawaz, thank you very much for being on Hard Talk.
A pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Maajid.